Coleman didn't think that he was that badly wounded while he was lying on the medical bed, nearly naked with doctors and nurses fussing over him with devices. The medical staff didn't agree. Sure, he took shrapnel that nearly clipped some important arteries, and some of them were pretty large, and he probably was shot. But he was still alive. As far as he was concerned, even if it was painful, he could move around and stuff, so he had to be pretty much fine. Probably. Another sentiment the medical staff didn't agree with. "Sergeant Coleman, stop moving!" The ornery nurse hissed dangerously at him. Coleman just couldn't help but wiggle due to the extreme exhaustion he had to endure while in sustained combat. The man was so sleep-deprived, he felt like he was high as a fucking kite. Coupled with literal hallucinations, the only thing he could think about was complete ineligible garbage. "Can we just get a sedative over here?" The agitated nurse was simply sick of trying to keep the man still. "What was that word?" "Sedative." Coleman could have sworn he learned this word with Lyria before being shipped off to that shit show. Sedative. "Oh, no, sedatives!" He responded back in panic. It was apparent these Imperials were never briefed on human physiology, as the nurse's assistant rushed in with an auto-injector. "I have the male-rated injector," the assistant answered. Coleman couldn't find the words in that blasted language to stop the nurse, but it was too late. The Imperial slowly brought the injector to his saline drip, and with a satisfying hiss, the sedatives were in his drip feed. The Tari were going to have a hard lesson as to why you shouldn't give humans a mixture of benzodiazepine, rohypnol, and tons of opioids. Fuck it. It's party time, I guess. Hopefully I don't die this time, or at least shit myself, Coleman thought to himself as he prepared for another wild ride. Coleman's world suddenly started spinning as he felt the drugs take hold. "Oh!" he moaned when the hallucinations started kicking in. The nurse that injected the sedative started noticing something weird and walked closer to him, but instead of bending over, her neck stretched like a rubber band and brought her head an inch from his own. "Shit!" Coleman's eyes went wide as the nurse started growing more appendages to grab her instruments. Even though her patient had become still, the nurse became concerned he hadn't fallen unconscious. As a matter of fact, he became so tense that she could see the white of his knuckles as he gripped the edges of the medical bed with all his might. "What the? His pupils are dilating." Her voice filled with worry while she inspected Coleman's eyes with a light. Her concern began to skyrocket when he could hear him having a very difficult time trying to breathe, followed by gurgling sounds. "Doctor? Can you get over here, please?" She pressed against her earpiece. She looked over at the heart-monitoring machine when it started screaming that the human's heart started beating irregularly and began to slow down. Sergeant Coleman, can you hear me?" She started panicking more and shined a light in his eyes for a response. Seeing no matter where she squeezed, she wasn't getting a response. Then came the droning noise from the heart monitor indicating his heart had stopped, which caused the nurse to look at her assistant in horror. Doctor! Doctor! The assistant immediately ran out of the room at full speed, while the nurse started doing chest compressions. The moment the assistant burst through the door, she briefly came face to face with another Tory with light gray skin, and a golden crest on her head with a heartbroken and awful expression. Lyria stood outside of Coleman's room in complete shock, while more medical personnel started flooding inside. The doctor nearly shoved her aside when she came rushing past Lyria with a nasal device in hand. "Coleman!" She screamed and entered the room at the same time with the doctor, who had a nasal spray in her hand. Lyria still had the wherewithal to not interfere with the medical staff, as a large male nurse ripped open Coleman's shirt and took over the chest compressions, while another nurse put a resuscitation bag over his nose and mouth. Having his bare chest exposed, the medical staff then put 2 adhesive pads on his body, with wires sticking out. One of the pads went to his chest, right over his heart, and the other was placed on the side of his torso. The male nurse kept a rhythm when he pushed down on Coleman's chest in an attempt to jumpstart his heart. "Clear!" the doctor yelled, causing everyone to back away for a brief moment. Coleman's back arched as electrical current flowed through him in an attempt to correct his irregular beating heart. Lyria crumpled to the ground in the corner, and burst into tears while the male nurse went back to doing the chest compressions in an effort to revive the human. "Claire!" Another came out, causing Coleman's back to arch. Beep, beep, beep. The patient monitor machine kicked to life, indicating his heart was beating at a tentatively acceptable level. "Move!" the doctor yelled, literally pushing the male nurse out of the way and pulling off the resuscitation bag. She swiftly, but gently, pushed the nasal spray to the human's nose and pushed her thumb to the plunger, releasing all of its contents. "Roll him onto his side! Quickly!" the doctor ordered. Putting the resuscitation bag back over Coleman, the nurses did as ordered and kept manually pumping air into his lungs. After a few minutes, the entire room breathed a sigh of relief when Coleman groaned and showed signs of stirring. The doctor made sure to double-check that the patient monitor showed nominal signs and the human's breathing was steady before turning around with an unholy wrath. "Let this be a lesson to you all as to why you need to ask before giving humans fucking sedatives!" Turning around, the doctor screamed furiously at her nurses and slammed the nasal spray on the ground. Still hugging her knees in the corner and tears streaming down her face, Lyria looked up to see the nasal spray slide over to her, with the word Narcan/naloxone written in Imperial Standard. The doctor snarled one more time at the remorseful group before she stormed past them, but not before spotting a lone Tari in the corner of the room, nearly bawling her eyes out. "Who the hell are you?" she asked, looking back at her staff. Lyria didn't answer as she looked up at the irate physician, too stunned by the events to register what was being said to her. Seeing the tears stream down her face, the doctor seemed to put two and two together, and literally smacked herself in a facepalm. "You emperor-damned idiots! Let his lover in here to watch this shit!" She turned around to continue scolding everyone. "Unfucking believable!" This had to be Illyria's worst day to date. She couldn't help but wonder just how many more years of therapy she was going to need to overcome this one. Every head other than the doctor was honed in on her with a mortified face. Not a single one of them had noticed the teary-eyed woman's entry. With her rage reaching an absolute boiling point at the massive slack-jawed idiots in front of her, the doctor couldn't believe how many of them managed to pass the first stages of indoctrination. "Out! All of you get out!" the doctor yelled, pointing at the door. "I'll do it my fucking self!" Watching the mass of people basically stampede past her and squeeze through the door, Lyria couldn't help but feel a tinge of anxiety flow through her. They all looked like their lives, or more precisely their careers, were hanging in the balance, and they just wanted to be out of sight and out of mind. Turning her head back to the origin of the yelling to see the doctor was now looming directly over her, with her hands on her hip. "Come, you can't stay here," the doctor said gently while she brought her hand forth to help Lyria up. "The poor man needs to get some rest." Lyria's gaze drifted between the doctor's cramped face, as the physician did her best to put on an amicable expression, and the hand floating in front of her. "Please, be at ease. I've gone through all 3 phases of medical indoctrination, and I'll personally see to his recovery." The doctor tried to soothe the apprehensive woman. "He's in capable hands." Seeing no other option but to trust the woman, Lyria took the hand in front of her and pulled herself up to her feet. Lyria took one last look at Coleman before she walked through the hospital room doors and gave a deep sigh. "Should I come back tomorrow?" she asked, still staring at the human. The doctor brought a finger up to her chin and thought for a moment. She wasn't extremely familiar with human physiology, but she knew they were hardy and recovered fast. "I can't guarantee he'll be lucid, but I'll allow you to see him," the physician answered. Giving a nod of understanding, Lyria turned around and walked out of the room. It wasn't an ideal answer, but it was better than she hoped. Letting one more sigh escape her lips as she walked down the hallway, Lyria took out her datapad in order to schedule another appointment with her therapist. However, the moment she turned it on, she realized something was off. I'm an idiot," she muttered to herself, seeing the human military lock screen asking for an access key. "Oh, fuck me." Elijah groggily sat up in his bed. He felt like absolute shit. It had only been a couple of days since the battalion returned to base, but Elijah still felt like he had been asleep for a week. Throwing his legs over the side and dropping down, it seemed every muscle screamed in protest, causing him to crumble to the floor. Daily routine seemed absolutely impossible, as the poor man couldn't even stand without consciously trying to balance himself. Fuck ass bitch, the medic cursed. Elijah slowly lifted himself up, using the steel bedpost as support, and gingerly made his way over to his dresser. Staring down at the open drawer, he couldn't help but give a long and drawn-out sigh, due to how such a mundane task was now a significant hurdle in his day. I hate my life, Elijah muttered to himself, scowling. After 10 minutes of procrastination, the man finally got his uniform on and sorely walked himself into the common room, expecting to see Coleman sprawled out on the couch waiting for him. Coming to an abrupt stop at the empty couch, Elijah turned to the closed door and prepared to knock when he remembered. Right, hospital, Elijah thought to himself, as he withdrew his hand and made his way to the shoe rack. Moving his way to the shoe rack, the medic decided it was probably proper to pay him a visit later in the day. Today's itinerary was completely full, and first on the list was food. Elijah liked to think he earned a hot, delicious meal after that long week of condensed, steaming garbage. Running through hell to pull someone who had holes in them to safety, fighting off rabid, psychotic reptilians as he patched up whatever idiot stayed out of cover for too long, and raiding a literal, dark, evil lair. Just from the lives he saved alone, he deserved at least a meat bun. But, as Elijah made his way downstairs, expecting the usual bustle and boisterous environment, he was instead met by the dreadful silence of a deserted common room. Only a few souls populated the place, and they all clustered around a row of rifles and pictures. The Wall of the Fallen. Lives he couldn't save. Or didn't. Spotting the other medic of the platoon, he noticed the woman was glancing between several pictures. We couldn't save them, she said, looking back at Elijah. Elijah stood there conflicted. Does he placate her with empty words and fake emotion? He always had an issue with empathy, other than having a surface-level understanding in order to socially survive. We can't save everyone, Sherry, Elijah responded. Sherry's eyes hardened as she held a gaze with Elijah, and then turned around to face back at the picture. I'd be mourning you just the same if it was your picture up there, she said while turning to walk away. Wrong answer, Elijah internally scolded himself, while he watched Sherry disappear beyond the doors. He just couldn't understand what she was so upset about. It wasn't like they were omnipotent gods that could bring back any comrade from the brink of death. They could only do so much, and difficult decisions needed to be made. Turning his eyes toward a picture of a woman he let bleed out in order to save another, Elijah couldn't help but wonder if that was what Sherry was trying to get at. Morning, huh? He muttered to himself before he too walked out of the barracks doors. Outside was equally melancholic, as only a sparse few soldiers were seen loitering around, and only supply vehicles rolled by. It was to be expected, however. With an 11% casualty rate, the battalion needed to settle down and lick its wounds. Elijah slowly meandered his way over to the mess hall, to check if there had been any updates in food quality during their brief excursion. Maybe they finally had pulled their head out of their ass and got a shipment through. However, all it took was to walk through the giant metal doors to answer this question. Nothing had changed. What the fuck do you mean another ship burned in the atmosphere? A brawny soldier screamed at one of the kitchen staff. We've been served this fucking shit for over a month! The mass of soldiers yelled, Yeah! In a chorus behind him, egging him on further. Elijah just stopped at the entrance of the mess hall and stared at the perpetual disaster that was unfolding in front of the kitchen. A horde of MPs were out in force, failing to look menacing in order to prevent a riot. It seemed low morale was base-wide. Looking around to see any familiar faces, Elijah spotted Kuribayashi lifelessly poking her ketchup spaghetti. She brooded with a listless expression, contemplating why she still existed, until she spotted Elijah walking towards her. However, instead of the excited look he expected, her face contorted into one of dread and anguish. Stopping dead in his tracks, Elijah instantly knew something was up. He immediately started scanning the area for any signs of danger, and spotted nothing until he saw a familiar face, the military policeman, MP, Dale. That rat-fucking bastard was standing there whispering into the ear of the sergeant major and pointing directly at him. Run! Kuribayashi screamed. Elijah didn't need to be told twice. He was already spinning in order to sprint out of the door, but when he made his rotation, his eyes went wide in horror. Ugh! The medic felt the wind violently push from his lungs when another MP rammed him right into the stomach with a tackle. Disoriented, but still cognizant, Elijah wrapped his arm around the MP's neck as they fell back and threw his body weight backwards. The MP found himself literally catapulted over his target, landing on his back and having an elbow immediately smash into his forehead. Knocking the man senseless, Elijah pushed himself up once the MP's arms went up in order to protect himself, and staggered to the door. However, the breath was forced out of his lungs again when he felt another body spear him from behind, sending them both skidding across the floor. The two men scrambled on the floor, rolling and twisting, trying to get an advantage on each other. Elijah immediately recognized who he pulled into his guard, that double-crossing piece of shit who sold him out. Wrapping his attacker's elbow with his arm, Elijah put his right hand on the man's hip and violently torqued his body. The attacker found himself on his back, with Elijah menacingly staring down at him. "Dude, just fucking relax!" Dale tried to yell, but he was greeted with a fist to the face. There weren't words that Elijah was able to conjure to describe how satisfying it was for him to hear the thunk of a head recoiling back into the hard concrete, but he could make it happen again. Dale was dazed after the first few blows, but he finally brought his arms up to shield himself from the incoming barrage. Elijah reared up for a vicious elbow strike, when yet again another body slammed into him, pulling him off of Dale. Biting her lips so hard that it was bleeding, Kuribayashi debated on whether to intervene or not. Every fiber of her being told her to go help Elijah, but her career as a soldier would be unequivocally over. "No, that's stupid. That would be a guaranteed court-martial," she thought to herself, while her face contorted in displeasure. While Kuribayashi sat there, trying to decide her course of action, Elijah got blindsided by another MP and tumbled to the floor. "Fuck this!" she angrily barked. Jumping from the table, the enraged woman darted down the rows of tables and tackled a fresh MP that came to help subdue the ornery medic. Watching all this from the front of the queue, Schmidt was caught in between a mass of angry soldiers and a horde of MPs that were keeping them from the kitchen. Looking back at the scuffle that his fire team found themselves in, he couldn't help but feel a small tinge at his heart to help. The private contemplated for a moment, trying to find a solid plan of action, and looked down at the slop in his hand. An evil smile crept across his face as he looked up at the raging sergeant major and his jackboot thugs. They were in a screaming match with soldiers just feet away from each other. Creeping closer to the front, Schmidt positioned himself right behind the giant of a soldier and readied his plate. "Fuck the police!" Schmidt bellowed, throwing his plate tray at the sergeant major and pushing the screaming soldier as hard as he could. Rocking forward, the giant soldier slammed into the sergeant major as he stumbled forward. This prompted a swift and violent reaction from the MPs, as they swarmed the giant in order to restrain him. However, with every mass of angry people, all it takes is one little incident to turn it into a giant clusterfuck. The mass of hungry and angry soldiers was triggered by the fact that law enforcement swarmed their unofficial spokesman and surged forward in their lines to get him back. Food, trays, and bodies flew everywhere as the incident started to spiral out of control, turning into a giant free-for-all. With the help of Kuribayashi, Elijah managed to gain the upper hand in the melee, but all the MPs seemed to stop and gawk past him, looking deeper into the mess hall. Bewildered by their hesitation, he looked back and saw nothing but absolute anarchy and a sea of violence unfold just a few dozen meters away. Elijah had to act fast and take advantage of the situation, while everyone was stunned into inaction. "Come on, let's get the fuck out of here!" he yelled, grabbing Kuribayashi's hand and pushing down Dale, who was in the process of getting back up. "Ow, wait!" Kuribayashi cried out, stumbling through the doors, trying to regain her balance. Blowing through entire crowds of MPs and soldiers trying to enter the cafeteria, Elijah and Kuribayashi ran across the street and into a complex of small buildings in order to evade anyone that may be trying to pursue them. The two just kept turning and weaving between buildings until the sounds of yelling slowly faded in the background. Putting his hand against the wall to catch his breath, Elijah felt a creeping sense of familiarity. When he looked up, the man's eyes began to twitch in frustration when he found himself back where he started. His barracks. "What do we do now?" Kuribayashi asked, huffing and puffing after sprinting the entire way. Elijah dragged his hand down his face in derision. There weren't any good options here, but he knew for a fact that no matter what they did, they were pretty much fucked. The two snapped their heads towards blaring sirens as they started to make a turn down the path they were on. Without even thinking about it, Kuribayashi immediately grabbed Elijah and shoved him through the door. The two staggered for a few meters before falling on the ground in a fashion that ended up with Elijah being straddled by Kuribayashi with his hand on her chest. However, at that very moment a particular medic just so happened to be on her way up to their room when she turned around to see what the commotion was. Both parties awkwardly stared at each other for several seconds before someone decided to address the issue. "I tripped," Kuribayashi said with threatening eyes. Not even fazed by Kuribayashi's look, Shiri just continued to stare in disgust and judged them even more. "Right, I get it, postnatal hormones and all, but at least do this in your rooms." Shiri rolled her eyes and continued up the stairs. Elijah let out a sigh. It seemed that the opinion his peers had of him just kept getting lower and lower. He was basically farming L's like it was spring. Noticing the weight wasn't getting off his waist, he looked up and noticed his partner in crime had a contemplative look on her face, while she continued to stare at the stairs. "Rika?" Elijah inquired with a raised eyebrow. It took a few extra seconds for Kuribayashi to register that she was being beckoned, when she finally decided to look down. "What floor is your room on?" she said with a glint in her eyes.